Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Roddy. Roddy, for everyone out there listening, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Roddy Roediger. I'm a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, professor of cognitive psychology.
Cognitive psychology. Okay, what about cognitive psychology do you focus on?
My main focus is in learning and memory. So anything about how people learn, how people remember, how people retrieve what they know. And I also study something called collective memory, which is how people remember in groups. So say how Americans remember the Civil War or World War II or anything else, how they remember 9/11, that kind of thing.
Do you find that it's like when it comes to collective memory, because I've talked about collective memory and like experiences with like UAP, like if you have one person that says I saw a UFO, but then you have a bunch of people saying they saw one, I start wondering like how many people actually saw one and how many people are just agreeing because they remember being that they were there, but they never remember looking up. Like some of these encounters you talk about with people, they'll be like, yeah, I remember that. And it's like, well, you were staring at your phone the whole time. You didn't even look up and see it. I saw it, just me. And then you see the separation a little bit.
Yeah. One thing I've studied is something we call the social contagion of memory, which is how people, when they're in a group and they're exchanging ideas and thoughts, how they'll pick up one idea from somebody else and then believe that it's their memory too. And so we do that in laboratory paradigms where we have complete control over what happens. And it's not as exciting as UFOs, but it's the same principle that say we have everybody look at one scene of a kitchen and something happening in the kitchen. And then later on, two people are talking back and forth, and their job is to remember everything that was in the kitchen. And one person who is a confederate or a helper of the experimenter, who's not really a subject, says something that wasn't in the kitchen scene. And it can either be something really common, like a toaster, there wasn't a toaster there, or something like oven mitts, which is also plausible, but not something that was actually there. And what will happen is the other person, the real subject, will later, when they're asked to report exactly what they saw, and they're told, look, that other person made mistakes. The other person might have said things that weren't right. Just tell us what you're absolutely sure you saw in the scene. They still report things like the toaster. And with very high confidence, they said, yeah, I'm sure there was a toaster in the scene, even though there wasn't. So they picked it up from somebody else, and it wasn't their own memory in some sense.
What are the influences of memory? Like, I think we go like, well, it's just the stuff you remember. I go, yeah, but if you're giving an account of something and somebody higher up than you, let's say a military position, someone higher up than you says this, then you're probably more than likely going to be like, I think I did see that. I think I did see that, only because that person's of a higher position, which just make memory even more complicated once you think about it. Cause it's like, what did your eyes perceive? That's why you have like, when you have like separate testimonies from different people, they could know for sure they were both at the same event, but they might have different accounts from the story because their brain, whether it's like an environmental factor of like why you like the things that you like, you're paying attention to more things. If I had to recount every single memory I had with someone that I was in the memory with, they'd be like, oh, we went to a water park, we had so much fun. I'd be like, I remember the concrete had some cracks in it, because I'd be staring at the floor most of the time wherever I go anywhere.
Yeah, nope, that's absolutely the case. And if you talk to police officers who are charged, let's say there's an automobile accident, and the police officer will go around and get witness testimony from everybody involved in the accident. And the strange thing is they're often very conflicting, even though it just happened a few minutes ago and everybody involved, but they have different perspectives and they're in different parts of the accident. I was involved in a traffic accident once, driving my kids to school many years ago. And I thought I had a really great view of the scene, and I wasn't involved. the cars were swirling around in front of me, and I was able to stop. And one of them came right beside me, going the wrong direction. And anyway, the police officer came and interviewed me, and I told him exactly what I thought I saw, and I was just highly confident. And I asked him, well, look, I study this kind of thing. Can I see later what your accident reconstruction shows was correct? And he said, sure. So he showed it to me. Sometime later, I went and visited him, and I just had it all wrong. Even though I thought I had it all right, once he reconstructed, I realized what I was saying couldn't have happened that way. And he, I think, got it right, and I got it wrong. So it just shows exactly what you're saying, that this can happen to all of us.
Well, isn't that weird how your brain distorted that memory in such a way where in that moment before you were corrected, you thought this was 100% exactly what happened and nobody would tell you differently. But then, like the invention of the body cam or just invention of footage in general that shows an exact scene. Like I watch half my, like if you watch a VHS tape or watch a DVD or recording of yourself, you're like, did I really? I guess I did do that. It like confirms it where it's like, there's no way that this could be false or this could be wrong. It must be my memory. And then immediately all your notions and all your beliefs that this memory was 100% solid become shattered in a sense. And now it's confined by this real proof that this is actually how it happened.
Yeah, no, I'm afraid happens to all of us, and we don't realize it because we're always sure we're right, and whatever else is out there is wrong because we trust our memories. And we shouldn't go overboard that, we wouldn't be here if our memories were totally uh, false all the time. Obviously, if we couldn't trust our memories to some degree, how to get to work, how to, go to the grocery store or whatever. So we do. Dan Schachter, Harvard, has a phrase he uses, which I picked up, called memory has a fragile power. It can be very powerful. We can remember things quite well, but then on the other hand, we can be led into error pretty easily too. So it's tricky going back and forth as to what you can believe and what you can't. Usually confidence is a good indicator of accuracy, though. Not always. I study situations where it's not where confidence is not a good indicator, just like in my experience. But usually, if you're really confident something usually did happen that way.
Is that most of the time that would probably taper off if it was like a extended period of time. Like if your confidence would dweem probably from a 5-year memory compared to one that
Oh,
just happened yesterday.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What are the other influential factors when it comes to memory, though? If we talk about authority, like obviously fear could be one, but like there's certain things like I remember just from a smell. And I'm like, I have no idea where that came from, but it's there and it's somewhere deep in my consciousness or deep in my subconscious, I'd say.
Yep. Nope. It's deep in your brain. The organ for the sense of smell is close to the hippocampus, which is the center for the brain that is greatly responsible for learning and memory. And smells do have people have studied, not me personally, but a lot of people have studied memory for smells and how smells can trigger a very old memory. You come back in contact with something, and suddenly that smell takes you back to your childhood or some earlier point in life when that smell is associated with something. And even though you're not trying to think of that something, the smell automatically activates that memory. And it's fascinating. We don't understand quite how that works yet.
Well, how do we collect memory? I know we have to like see it or experience it, but the way that you can recall it, or you can kind of like, I wouldn't say roll your eyes and look inside of your head, but the way you can kind of have like this, what I would call a daydream in a sense, it's so, I mean, it's creating like a motion picture, like a 3D projection into your head. So it's like the way that I start receiving it, I started thinking about this where I was like, if I blink a bunch of times, is it like taking a photo? Is it like photoshotting in your head or something like that? Because it's that clear in some cases.
In very few cases, and even when it's that clear, it might not be quite right. There's a phenomenon called flashbulb memory, which is um, people who have very vivid memories, usually of public events. So, say if you ask people, well, if you ask people my age, I don't know how old you are, but what happened on 9/11? So, not what happened in New York or Washington or Pennsylvania, but what happened to you? Tell us about your day on 9/11. I can tell you all about my day on 9/11. What I did, it's just a very I was ducking in and out watching TV and then trying to go about my day working. And that night we were called to campus, everybody in the psychology department to be there for students, even though I'm not a clinical psychologist. Um, and it was a very emotional day. And so I remember that quite well. That would be, and we talked about it a lot afterwards, of course. That's a flashbulb memory. And I have one for the day John F. Kennedy was shot. I was in high school then, and other events too, like the assassination of Robert Kennedy a few years later. But people have shown that even these cases where we have this high confidence and high belief, we can be wrong on details. So, for example, one psychologist at Emory University happened to be asking his students, giving them questionnaires. And right after the Challenger, the spaceship, the Challenger, exploded soon after taking off, I think it was in 1986, from Cape Canaveral. And a school teacher was aboard, and the whole country was watching this event because it was a big deal. And it exploded. I still have that image in my mind I saw it, I don't know how many times. And the psychologist at Emory asked people in his class, they were mostly first and second year students. He asked them to write down where they were, what they were doing when they heard the news about the Challenger. And so they did that. And then 2 years later, when they were seniors, he went back and found as many of those students as he could and asked them the same question. Where were you? What were you doing when you heard the Challenger exploded? And about 2/3 of the students were right on. They remembered exactly where they were, what they were doing, and so forth. But about 1/3 of the students didn't. They wrote down something of which they were pretty sure, but it was not the thing they wrote down 2 years before. And mostly what happened was that it seemed was that students, when they heard something like, I was coming out of class and I bumped into my friend and my friend told me. But then later they would remember, oh, I was sitting in the student union and I saw those vivid pictures on the screen. That's how I found out. So probably both those memories are true. They probably were sitting in the student union at some point watching those pictures, but they confused that second time the vivid pictures, and they forgot about the kind of incident where their friend told them. That was actually what we call the reception event, or when they first learned about it. But they confused that with when they saw those highly vivid pictures later. So even these things we think of as flashbulb memories, where we think we'll never forget this moment, sometimes those are probably in error, even though we're so highly confident of them.
Is that just
But it's
because
years later.
Yeah, but is that just because the brain's amount or capacity to like it's like data, it's like holding space on a hard drive. Like eventually you start clearing things out, but you don't necessarily get to choose what things you get to clear out. I think I could try and remember like a specific thing I wanted to remember 100%, like I'm going to remember this. But mostly it's another part of the situation or another part of like a trip or something that I remember, not as that crucial part in that moment that was crucial to me.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, one way to remember something, one of the things I study is how to improve memory. And I study people who have highly developed very superior memories to what I could do even when I was young, or what
Study me.
most
I have
people.
1,000 something episodes and I remember every single person. I can't tell you their number, but I remember all who's been on my show.
Wow. Have you ever, how do you know? You've tested yourself?
I've definitely had people like quiz me, like, I was listening to this episode with this guest, and I'm like, oh, that's this number, and then that's this number, and that's this number. I could do that type of
So
stuff.
you do remember the number.
I guess I do remember the number. Yeah. Look, my
If I
memory's
gave you,
faulty now.
if I gave you a list of 2,000 names, the 1,000 you've interviewed, and another 1,000 plausible names, and some famous, some not. You could pick out the ones
You
you've interviewed.
you definitely like if I'm gonna stick with a safe bet and say if you gave me 600 something names and then you also included 600 fake ones, I can 100% incorporate which ones have been on the show and which ones I haven't been. I can't remember the basic like certain principles of the conversation. And this was like a thing that I said in the beginning I was gonna do. I was gonna remember every single conversation I ever had. And I did it for a good while. I could remember even the number. But then eventually, once I started hitting around the 700, 800 mark, it became a little bit harder to remember the number, but I knew specifically I had talked to that person.
Yeah. Anyway, if you really want to remember something for the long term, the best, I think one of the best ways to do it without going, using some complicated system is simply retrieve it again from time to time. So if you wanted to remember some event in your life, well, write it down and after it happened. We don't really have mental pictures in our heads, although it feels, we do have some mental pictures, but they're not like a movie. Uh, Mental imagery is a phenomenon that's been widely studied for years, and imagining something really helps memory. If you have something verbal and you want to remember it better, converting it to an image really helps. And that's why figurative language that expresses a story, is especially memorable. You'll remember a novel that drove you through it much better than you will reading a philosophy textbook or something like that. That's not highly imageable and highly memorable. Abstract things are harder to remember than concrete, imageable things. But anyway, going back to the main point, if you want to remember something on the long term, just keep retrieving it. And that's one thing that builds up these flashbulb memories, is you keep retrieving how I learned about this. I keep going back to that day of 9/11. For me, I think I can remember quite accurately what I did during that whole day. It was a very emotional day. It just made my whole day seem emotional, and emotional things are memorable too.
It's everyone who's experienced or been of an older age, I'd say, that had a 9/11 experience. Everyone could tell you exactly what they were doing. Like I remember watching the TV. I remember this. Everyone has usually starts off saying that, but I just start going to, does it have to be something so severely emotional that causes you to remember that? Or are there ways besides retrieving something, but are there ways to be able to have like something like maybe a smell, but just something positive that you could have like a good experience? Because I feel like more times than not in today's age, you'll have people that will remember what the feeling of being angry is like, or what the feeling of being mad or sad is like. But you don't have a lot of people remembering the feeling of being happy. People go like, well, it's smiling all the time. It's this. It's like, yeah, necessarily that's not the essence of happy. Like if you could put happy in a color, what color would you describe it? People will be like blue. It's like, well, blue is also linked in with sad. What about red's linked in with angry? You remember those because they have distinctive colors, but you also don't take an account in your memory to remember the moments you feel happy. That's a weird thing.
Yeah, it is that. But interestingly, as you age, people remember many more of the happy things in their lives than they do the sad, depressing things, unless they're depressed. But for normal aging, there's what's called a positivity boost in later life that even people who used to be depressed. I've had series of depressions in my life, but I don't anymore. I've kind of outgrown depression for some reason. That's kind of weird. I'm pretty old. I don't have that long to live. But back when I was in my 20s, I was depressed a lot. But why? I was in my 20s. I was in the peak of life. And now I'm be 75 next month, and I feel great.
Do you think that's a time thing though? Because it seems like for a lot of young people, I'm 24, but I have an unrealistic expectation of what I need to be doing to save the amount of time that I have. And you actually realize that you have more time than you think you do. But it's so weird because if you asked me to remember everything I did today, I couldn't tell you because I've done way too much. Like I'm constantly putting up a bigger workload, which makes it even more difficult to remember even the small stuff in a sense.
Yeah, true. The more things you do, the harder it is to remember them. You can show that in many ways, but there's in effect Q overload. It's called, that you just have so many things you can only remember a fraction of them. But but you don't get you remember a whole lot of what you do today. I mean, of what you do every day, that they're routine things. I don't really need to remember breakfast
Yeah.
6 days ago. It's just no point in it. So the uh,
Well, let me ask you this. How do you deal with a situation? Do you think people's memories are getting better over time? Like, are you seeing a longer capacity, maybe over a long time period, or are you seeing it diminish? Because we're at a point right now where people have to remember 8 different passwords to be able to log into like their Netflix, their Hulu, their Gmail. So I'm like, in a sense, is this training our brains? Because half the time I still have to use the recovery password.
Yep. Yeah, me too. Uh, there's a big debate about this. What effect is the internet having on memory? With some people saying the actual opposite of what you just said, that if everything is available to us on Google, why do we need to remember it anymore? Um, but as you're pointing out, the fact that we have the internet also is demanding on memory. We got all these passwords, we got all these different things we pay attention to. I'm not on many social media, but all people who are on all these different social media, how do they keep up with all these things? How do they remember it? How do they have time to do it? And so the I think the internet is having a huge impact on cognition. I'm relatively positive. I mean, except for fake information, which is a big except there. That I mean, I think the internet is really good for if you use it the right way. I think it's really good for your learning and memory and your knowledge. But if you expose yourself to fake news all the time, um, obviously that's a danger.
Well, would some of the people on the other side be just looking at the concept of like if you focus more time into social media, remembering what to do on your social media or internet presence, you're probably neglecting other areas of your life. Like, for instance, if I tell someone to do something like I need to be picked up at this time, if they say, I'm sorry, I forgot, or I don't remember, is because they probably weren't paying attention in that moment. And it brings up another bigger issue, which is they have other priorities on their mind, which means that they're funneling more brain power into specific things that they're going to be doing 5 minutes from now, 10 minutes from now, rather than focusing on the moment when they were supposed to be consuming information.
Right. No, you've got to be present in the moment. And the biggest gateway to memory is paying attention in the first place. That, for example, when you meet people, one phenomenon happens to all is you meet people at some kind of party, or you go to some kind of event where you don't know many people, and you're introducing yourself to each other. And I often find 10 seconds later, I can't tell you the name they just told me. And so the main, advice to remember names is pay attention in the first place, repeat it in your mind, repeat it out loud if it's not awkward to do so, and try to get the name in the first place. And that's the critical time. It's hard to recover. Say, oh, I'm sorry. What was your name again? I mean, I have to do that all the time, but
In those situations, isn't that like an impression thing as well too? Because it's weird how our brain chooses what gets remembered. Like if we meet, I can meet 2 people at a party. One person's going to stick in my head, and that's why they're always like, wear a funny hat or be this type of guy, so you can stick in people's memory. But then there's other people where your just brain doesn't even want to make an attempt to remember the name. It's not that you're trying to be rude. It's just there's nothing about it that's attractive to some type of instinctual thing in your mind.
yeah. So yeah, some people will be more memorable than others to you. The other thing is when you're meeting somebody, you're also it's kind of like a dual task that you're trying to form an impression of them. You're looking at their eyes, their mouth, what they look like. Am I going to like this person, or they going to like me? And so you're thinking all those thoughts quickly, and the name is just one part of a big complex, and you're trying to take in. So um, you're paying attention to these other things more than you are to the name quite often.
What factors could play, like if I was going to say, if like not factors of what included in memory, but a factor that can play on the toll of memory, would that be like, would depression play a giant aspect in a lot of people's memory? Because I bet you if you ask the question to an adult what they probably wrote down in like kindergarten about what they were going to be at this age, they would have a different recollection, and they would probably get upset about what their childhood self wrote down.
Yeah, yeah, they very well could. Depression does cause memory harms memory. It's unclear exactly why. Whether, but if you're very depressed, I mean, lots of studies are showing if you're very depressed and you give people memory tasks, they don't do well. But if you give them both happy, sad, and neutral words, depressed people remember the depressing words, bitter, cold, sad. They'll remember words like that more than they will the other words. So it's like if the information coming in is congruent with your mood, you remember it better than if it's not. And so so it's not that they have generally bad memories. They just, I mean, they do have generally bad memories, but they do remember the words that are congruent with their mood a little bit better than others. And one problem with depression is that you can get into this cycle where you prefer to, if you're depressed, you prefer to read depressing novels. You prefer to listen to depressing music. You prefer, and it just creates this feedback loop where everything reinforces your being in depression. So one kind of mood therapy there is to get people to try to counter that. Look at, watch funny movies, listen to happy music, read funny novels, that kind of thing, because then that will help counter your depressed mood.
Now, when it comes to other capabilities of like collective memory, what's one issue that you face studying collective memory?
Well, collective memory is a little bit hard to study because it's how we remember in groups. So that could be your family, it could be your city, it could be your state, it could be your country. I mean, groups at any level. My colleagues and I here at Washington University, and particularly Jim Lurch, who'd be a great person for you to talk to on the interview. He's been studying collective memory his whole life, particularly Russia. But we study national memory. So to give you an example of one type of research we did was we studied collective memories of people in 12 different countries for World War II. And except for one study, nobody in our studies were alive during World War II. We did have one study we did years ago with older adults who at least were alive during World War II. They weren't fighting it, but they were like teenagers or something living at home. And so we created a questionnaire and we asked people to list, among the things we did, we asked people to list 10 events, if they could, that were critical in the victory of World War II. What are 10 critical events for the Allies? And 8 of the countries we studied were Allied countries, and 3 of the countries we studied were Axis countries. And then we also had Poland that was stuck in the middle between
neutral.
Well, it wasn't neutral. It got attacked by both sides.
Yeah.
It was attacked by Germany, that was attacked by Russia. So 20% of people in Poland died during World War II. But the interesting thing, so we found even though Russia and the US were allies in World War II, when they list the events that were important for the victory in World War II, the two sets of events were almost not overlapping. There was only one event that they shared in common. So you can guess what the US events were. We find it in every study. They remember the attack on Pearl Harbor. They remember D-Day. They remember the Holocaust. They remember dropping the bombs on Japan. And that's kind of the beginning, the middle, and the end of the war for the US. Pearl Harbor brought us into it, dropping the bombs ended it. And then D-Day was helping, obviously, end the war in Europe. But Russia, the Russians who did the same thing, they were on our side. They listed the Battle of Kursk, which most people in the United States have never even heard of.
Yeah.
But it was the largest tank battle in history. They listed the Battle of Stalingrad. More people died in the one Battle of Stalingrad than the US had died in the whole war. And Stalingrad and Kursk were the first 2 times the German army was ever defeated. German armed forces were ever defeated. So those really were turning points. And those happened way before the US and Canada and other countries invaded Europe at D-Day. So Russia was fighting 1941, 42, 43, 44, 45, while the US in Europe didn't even come in until 1944. And so it's just different sets of events that people thought were important, emphasizing their own country.
Well, those
Uh,
are the specific things that were taught, and depending on where you got your education from as well, too. In the United States, the things that are ingrained to you for like 5 years or 6 years in high school are freaking World War II, Pearl Harbor, Holocaust. These are things that are spent long hours after hours, sessions every single day for a year or a couple of years. So that's what we're going to remember. That's why people probably haven't heard of that tank battle, because that's not what was taught over here. That's not what we focused on.
that's part of it. But when we asked people in China to list the important events of World War II, they listed the same ones the Americans did. People in
Well,
uh,
that was our main conflictor, though. That was like the battle between those two, in a sense, was like the major ones that were taught, at least for us over here, was like Pearl Harbor and like these major events. And then, well, are we talking about China or Japan?
China.
Okay, well, I mean, maybe because they're close, they're close by each other, that they could be taught the same thing.
Maybe,
But
but they're communists like the Soviet Union was. So you would think they might remember the Russian version of the story, the Soviet Union version of the story. But every other country we surveyed, even Germany was the one who lost to the Soviet Union in all those battles. Even Germans remember the war the way Americans do, and not the way the Soviets do. Uh, and so, besides education, that explains it in the US. But what we think also is important is the US has produced all these war movies, Saving Private Ryan, all these movies that are shown all over the world. And the Soviet Union didn't do that as much. There is a movie called Stalingrad, which came out, I think, in the early 2000s, but it wasn't a big hit. And so the Soviet story never got told to the other countries. But if you look, you know, if you ask, well, what was the importance? And we asked the question, what do you think your country's contribution was to World War II in the victory of the war? We asked the 8 allied countries. And so United States people said 54%, if I remember correctly. The United Kingdom, people in England said 53%. That's 107% right there. Soviet Union would tested Russia for the previous Soviet Union, or for the Soviet Union, and they said 75%. They think they won the war. And then we asked them to take other countries into account, and they moderated their response down to 61%, but they still thought they won World War II. And in Europe, I think you can make a case that the Soviet contribution was overpowering. They might have won the war if D-Day had never happened. But obviously, they don't list anything in the Pacific because they weren't involved in the Pacific. But then, if you look at U.S. war casualties in World War II, we're about 418,000 deaths. And that's awful. 418,000 is a big number. Nobody's absolutely sure how many soldiers were lost in the Soviet army, but the best guess is it was between 9 million and 12 million. So you look at that magnitude of difference between the Soviet losses and the US losses. And those US losses were all in Europe, of course. There were many of them in the Pacific. But in Europe, the Soviet Union just had tremendous losses at those big battles that we've almost never heard of, Battle of Moscow, Battle of Stalingrad, and so forth. So it just points up these different perspectives on the war. And that's important right now, because if you look at why Vladimir Putin said he invaded Ukraine, well, it's a continuation of World War II. He says, well, there's Nazis. And, he accuses the leadership of being Nazis, even though Zelensky is Jewish. And he says this is a threat to that NATO wanting to come into Ukraine is just like countries wanting to invade us in World War II. And we've got to stop it before it starts. And that's why we're invading Ukraine. And that's what the Russian people, many of them, believe. This is a just war to prevent another World War II type situation.
Well, it's a weird combination between time and memory. And the thing is that I don't know how we can look up tricks about how to hack your mind. Like there's videos of people like how to hack your mind to remember this or remember that. But there's also like there's been government experiments about trying to figure out what makes the mind tick as well too. MK Ultra is the biggest example. Whether you consider that a conspiracy or not, I'm just saying it links into a whole lot of stuff where you start wondering like advertisements. I feel like I remember more advertisements in my life than I actually remember the freaking show. I mean, it's good programming, it's good marketing. You remember everyone. If I asked you to name a soft drink, you'd probably say Coca-Cola because that's just been brainwashed into everybody's head because it's been shown in advertising. I mean, it's not like so conspiratorial or so crazy to think that there's really good ways to market, and it's in a sense it's like propaganda. That's what you can consider marketing in some sense. And propaganda, for instance, the things that we remember, American remembering specific stuff uniquely to America. And then we talk about the film industry, largely dominant in America. Most of the films are American that everyone else sees, so they're going to remember the same thing. That's the best propaganda tool I have ever heard in my entire life, and it scares me because I think our minds are really fragile. And I think like there's a talks about Dunbar limits. You can only remember a certain amount of faces. You can only remember a certain amount of people's names or something like that. And then it ends up dropping off some and trying to remember new ones. And I start going, does any of this lead to like a degeneration of the brain, like a neurodegenerative disease or something that's not genetic, but just dementia, early stages of it?
No, I mean, we never, if you, I mean, dementia is, I mean, not caused by psychological conditions, but caused by physical, brain deterioration. We have a big group of people studying Alzheimer's at my university. But outside dementia, we never lose our capacity for learning. I mean, as I say, I'm 75 years old. I'm reading all the time. I'm learning new stuff all the time. My mind is not as good as it once was, but I'm doing fine. And unless you have dementia, that will be true your whole life. You see these people who are 100 years old, still mentally active, still reading, still conversing. Their bodies might be getting more frail, but their minds seem to be doing pretty well. But other people, of course, get dementia or some other dementing disease, like either Alzheimer's or some other dementing disease. And then you really won't learn well and you won't remember well, and it'll just get worse and worse.
Yeah.
So lots of people are working on how to fix that, how to prevent Alzheimer's.
Have you dipped into the topic of brain fog just because it seems like one that's gonna like kind of trending a little bit now? It seems like more people are knowing more about it just because of a concept of it seems like more people are suffering from it.
Right, long COVID. One of the symptoms of long COVID is what people are calling brain fog, and you can um, you can get that from other things too.
Yeah.
Anesthesia, like I had anesthesia 2 days ago, and the rest of even though I wasn't completely under, I was awake the whole time. But the rest of the day I was pretty foggy, and then I slept it off, and I felt good the next day and feel fine today. That's why my right eye is so red from cataract surgery. But um, but brain fog is a real thing, and I'm sure if you when you give people a battery of cognitive tests, they're well aware that I'm not as good today. I'm not as sharp today as I usually am. But nobody really understands it all yet. There are people, especially people in anesthesia, doing studies on that because some people don't come out of anesthesia as quickly as others, and they're foggy for a week or two, maybe even longer. So, but I've never studied that in particular and don't know a lot about it.
Do you think that routines play a giant factor into memory, not just remembering something, but also like the ability to go on autopilot? I talk about like it seems like a lot of times people are on autopilot just because they get stuck on the same thing every single day. And half the time I'm at work, I don't even remember what I just did. I just know I did my job, I guess, and I go home, and next thing I know, I'm like, all right, I can watch TV. Like, what? I'm awake
Yeah,
now.
yeah. Habit habit rules our lives. There's whole
Mhm.
books on habit and how to break bad habits and how to maintain good habits. But much of our lives are run by habit. I mean, we tend to do the same things, with variations every day. And I do that, and probably, as you just said, you do too. And so that makes it harder to remember specific events if they're similar. The more similar events are, the harder it is to remember even one of them. So if you even take an event like, if I think back to my when I'm growing up, and I think, what was could I remember Thanksgiving in 1957? I was 10 years old. Uh, and the answer is no. I mean, I can remember a generic what was Thanksgiving like when I was growing up. And even though the one in 1957, I'm sure was very memorable right after it happened, my chance of getting back to that specific event today is very small. I mean, I can remember, well, usually I was over at my grandparents' house. Usually the whole family was there. Usually it was a big group. Usually it was late afternoon, but I can't remember any one specific Thanksgiving. Now, if something strange had happened, if the whole table had collapsed in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner or something, then I'd probably remember it because that would have stood out. Distinctive things are well remembered. Things that are very similar, it's hard to remember just one of them, but you'll get a general sense of how they all unfolded.
What do you think about the idea of time and actually losing memory? Like, do you think that it also plays like some type of an important factor? Because when my grandma passed away, it was like I never want to forget her laugh. And then I can't really remember it 100% accurate like I used to, which is kind of sad saying it out loud, but it's definitely helped me get through like that. We all had dogs. We all had someone that was a part of our life for 8 to 10, 12 years or something like that. I remember I had 2 dogs. They're no longer with us, but I mean, they were a big part of my life, but I also don't think about them a whole lot. It's not like, I don't know, is it a moving on process type deal? But I think it's also beneficial that time does heal wounds in a sense, but in a sense, our memory does forget some crucial aspects that honestly hinder our growth.
Yeah, you raise big questions there. How we remember, I mean, I've lost a lot of people in my life because I'm a lot, my parents and grandparents are gone. My brother died last year, my younger brother. So these are hard things to overcome. My mother died when I was 5 years old, and that was a big traumatic experience for me. And I still think I remember her reasonably well, but just snapshots, kind of. And probably what I'm remembering often is the pictures I still have of her. Uh, and you're right. At the time, right after she died, I thought of her all the time. Now, not so often. And it's just the way it is. If you go get over something, some people can't get over grief, and that's really bad. I mean, you don't want to be stuck in that awful grief. The feeling of grief, I think, is just one of the worst feelings you can have. And the fact that time somehow brings you out of it, and or processes operating over time bring you out of it, that's really helpful. And if you couldn't do that, if time or whatever happens over time didn't do that, um, you'd be in really bad shape. And some people are who just can't get over grief.
From your work, have you experienced at least more of a better respect for the brain than maybe the general public does? Because if we talk about grief, for instance, letting us forget wounds, it's still pain. But if we talk about remembering 9/11, that's grief, that's pain, but it's a different type. The other one that we forget is more intimate, which seems like it would be the opposite way around, that we would remember the more intimate and then we would kind of forget the collective experience. But now we all remember the collective experience, or the everyone knows exactly where they were experience, to now we forget the most intimate one.
Well, I still have what I mean. Flashbulb memories are often reserved for public events, but you can have flashbulb memories yourself. So I can remember exactly the moment when I was told my grandfather died. He and I were very close. I can remember the exact moment when my father told me my mother died. Uh, so I still have flashbulb memories for those events, for my brother dying too, but that was just a year ago. Um, so uh, I'm not sure what you say. I mean, it's completely correct. I still have very vivid memories of those events that were personal, as well as 9/11 type events. It's probably high emotion that does it.
What about like surprise factors as well?
Yeah, no surprise. Surprise is anything that's new and distinctive and surprising. Those are well remembered. If you were to look out your window and see an elephant walking down the street, you would be very surprised, and you
Yeah.
would remember that event that happened in a regular old day for a very long time.
Have you conducted any like simple mind experiments on people? Like there's a one very common one where it was like a group of people going in and out in a circle, and then after the video clicks it says, "Did you see the gorilla?" And then it'll be a gorilla walking, and it's like, I didn't, what did they add that in? And you realize you're just not paying attention. Have you done any experiments like that?
I haven't. Those were done by a guy named Dan Simons at University of Illinois. He'd be a great person for you to talk to. He wrote a book called The Invisible Gorilla. I've got it right here. Uh, but yeah, I haven't done perception experiments like that. I could show you, I do in my class. I showed the gorilla one too. So many people have heard about it now, it almost doesn't work. But usually with college freshmen, it will work because they haven't had the same experiences. But I teach a freshman course on memory and sometimes show that. So yeah, you're told when you're looking at that movie to watch the people passing the basketball back and forth and they count the number of passes. So if you're busy doing that, you don't notice the gorilla, or some people do, but most people, I didn't the first time I saw it, see the gorilla walking through. I was busy counting those passes.
Well, it's like a math problem. You don't know the math problem, but then once someone shows you the answer, you're like, oh my God, I've seen this problem before. And somehow you get it.
Yeah. No, it's a very interesting phenomenon. So I spend my life doing experiments on humans about their memories, sometimes inducing false memories, sometimes looking to improve memory, studying other things, how well we can judge our own memories, what's called metacognition. How do I know what I know?
Is there a chain of command when it comes to memories? Like if you were going to be used in like a custody thing, or you were going to be used in some type of like criminal court case or something like that, is it like the amount of a person's awareness? Like I feel like if you're like someone maybe that's like lives in a bad neighborhood, or maybe has like some type of tendencies that are we call like, I don't know, not good tendencies. You tend to be aware of a lot more, whether that's an experience that you had in life that caused you to be more aware. But like I live in the second most dangerous city in the United States, basically Baltimore. So, I mean, I remember like I'm very cautious in my moves, I would say, because I know how things can play out. It's not like they're not like alternative realities, but they're like that car has never been here before, like stuff that normal people or average people walking down the street wouldn't even think of. But I'm just like, I remember, this car's been here for 2 days now, like just simple stuff like that. Now, people would call that paranoia, but I just like that's a sense of
No,
awareness.
yeah, situational awareness. No, I think, I think if you live in Baltimore, New York, or even I live in St. Louis, which isn't that safe. My neighborhood is very safe, but if you go to other neighborhoods or downtown, not that safe. So yeah, situational awareness is important, and that probably increases your memory for your environment. I mean, I can walk around my neighborhood and feel completely safe, so I can be lost in my own thoughts and not particularly aware of my environment. I'm usually walking my dog, so I'm
Yeah.
aware of him. So let's see, where
Well,
was
we
this
talked
going?
about a lot of stuff that influence memory, but one thing that memory influences is also our decision making. A lot of the way we remember stuff, a lot of the way we've experienced stuff really influences our decision making, whether we choose to take a risk or not as well too. And also it's develops in our habits. You could probably find a strong correlation with memory linking in with some aspects of addiction. Like there was addiction, opioid crisis going when I was in high school. It's the reason why I took chemical dependency, but I've stayed away from that because I watched so many of my friends get lost to it. And that's a memory thing that I'll never forget, but it's also put me on a different path as well too, which is decision making.
Yep. No, absolutely. Memory is critical. If you can't remember previous decisions and how other people have decided, you won't decide well yourself, but you can do that. So memory definitely helps decision making.
Have you ever seen this study about New York cab drivers where they have like this inflated part of their brain that remembers directions or street sign? Is that so? That's true. That's not like some random article
Well,
I read.
it was London cab drivers first, and people have had trouble replicating that. But the original authors of the London cab driver study think it's still true. I believe it's not my area of expertise, but of course I have heard about that. The hippocampus was enlarged in the London cab drivers, but even then you can't know what's cause and what's effect, because it could be that in London, you have to pass a very rigorous test of streets to become a cab driver. So is it only people with big hippocampuses that can pass the test, or did learning all those street names enlarge the hippocampus? So you can't really know unless you pick people ahead of time, and put some in the cab driver group and some in the no cab driver group, and then look to see if their hippocampus has got bigger. So even if it's true It doesn't mean that the more you use your hippocampus, the larger it will get. It might just be if you have a larger hippocampus, you can remember a lot more street names.
Now, is there any anomalies you can think of when it comes to people that have like what they would call a photographic memory or some type of memory that where they can remember like a whole New York skyline off of just one helicopter flight and then be able to draw the whole thing out in excruciating detail?
Yeah, I've seen videos about people like that. And when I used to teach introductory psychology to very large groups of people at Purdue University, I would always get somebody when I get to the memory part of the course who said, "Oh, my aunt has a photographic memory," or something like that. And I would always say, "Well, tell you what, ask them." Usually it was remembering uh, books, where things were on a page or something like that. I said, if they have a photographic memory, give them this test. Let them pick something they think they have a photographic memory for, like a page of text. So, and give them as long as they want. Photograph that page of text in your mind. And they say, okay, now I've got it. I say, okay, I've got the real page of text here. You've got your photograph. Now, go 5 lines from the bottom up and read the words backwards, or tell me the letters backwards across the page. I said, I've got the real page here. It's easy to do. You've got your photograph and nobody can do it. I mean, so what we talk about a very good visual image of being like a photograph, but it's really nothing like a photograph, except that you have this illusion that I see things in great detail. And you just don't, you can't remember things in that fine detail. Now, there are people with extraordinary memories, people who can remember amazing amounts of material using specific devices. I could give you the name of somebody if you want to interview them later, because they're very, I mean, they're just amazing people. I can't do what they do. But, you know, like one of the tests, one of the early psychology tests developed in the 1800s is what we just call digit span, 4-digit span. So I just give you 689-153, and you repeat back 681-593. And we just see how far you can go in doing that. How many can you get?
I did it in my head when you said it, and I was like, damn it, I got it wrong.
Oh, but anyway, so that test, most people do 7 plus or minus 2. And the reason the original phone numbers were 7 digits is because that's what psychologists said most people could remember most of the time. And the phone company wanted to avoid errors. They didn't want people dialing the wrong number, or back then it wasn't dialing, it was saying it out loud. But they didn't want them making mistakes because that was expensive. And so they tried to keep the phone number small. Now they've gotten really big as we've gotten more phones, of course. So we have 10 digits, you remember.
How many, how many things in society are set up like that to where there's been like psychological studies of the reason why this is this?
A fair number. For example, one of my favorite examples of is what's called the high brake mounted tail light. So it used to be, if you look at older cars, tail lights were at the bottom of the car. And we've always had the biggest type of automobile accident is the rear end collision, one car running into the one in front of them. And so some psychologists had the bright idea, well, maybe the reason people don't brake is because they don't see the tail lights, they're down too low. And so what they did was an experiment where they put tail lights on taxi cabs. They put artificial ones up high for half the cabs, and for the other half, they left them down where they were. And so what they found was rear end collisions greatly decreased for the high mounted tail lights where they're in the field of view. Usually we're looking straight ahead, we're not looking down. And so now if you look at all the cars, they have brake lights that are often very, very high, and some of them are just really, really bright.
They're at the top too.
Yeah, exactly, at the top. So where we're more likely to look. And so that was one big change of all the cars that came from a simple psychology experiment in Washington, D.C., which showed, look, if you designed the car so that you just put the brake light in people's field of view, then they'll be able to see it and they'll brake and not have the rear end collision. simple, but simple only after the fact. Nobody realized it before the study was done. They didn't realize that was the problem.
Yeah, I wouldn't even think to do a study like that in the first place. So good on whoever did that. But it's interesting to find out these little details and stuff because I think our brain, as much as we know about it, there is a lot of stuff that we honestly don't know about it either, and that's what makes it really
Absolutely, for
fascinating.
sure. As
Yeah.
people, more and more people going in all the time doing, I don't do this work, but brain imaging type work. And my wife, who you just saw briefly as we were setting this thing up, she's done a lot of that work over the years. She's a psychologist too, but more in the brain science part of the world.
What made you get interested in psychology?
I took a course in high school that I really liked, and then I took a course in college I really liked, and uh, I just thought this was the most interesting thing I could be doing with my life, and so decided to go into graduate school. And I went to undergraduate at Washington Lee University in Virginia, graduate school at Yale University, and the cognitive psychology was just starting then. So I was kind of on the ground floor of cognitive psychology. People have studied learning and memory for a long time in kind of a different tradition. But then when cognitive psychology started, it brought study of perception, learning and memory, thinking, problem solving, psychology of language, all of those are parts of cognitive psychology, brought them to the fore. And so I really enjoyed it. I mean, I don't regret for a minute having done what I did with my life.
Yeah, I came across a few people that study memory, but mostly it was always the perception angle or it was some type of psycholinguistics angle. And it's really crazy to see the different pathways that the brain kind of like you can really study about the brain. Cause I think when you say psychology, it's an umbrella term for sure, but there's so many niche categories in it where it's like people's response reactions to hot and cold, people's response reactions to certain words. And it's just like, it makes everything a little bit more complicated, which is also more fascinating about it as well, too.
Yep. Yep.
Well, Roddy, I appreciate you giving me your time, man. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
My website at Washington University has all my publications on it under the publications page, except for my books. And so just Google my name, Roddy Roediger, and you come up with my website. It's usually the first thing that pops up.
I'll make sure I link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.